Hi, great to be with you. I think this is much more than about semantics, and the argument I will be making is that these words, and it is only the phrase natural disasters, these words are particularly important within systems of power. We all operate within different kinds of systems of power, and within those systems of power, language becomes it becomes possible for those who have power to co-opt and adopt words which are then twisted and defined in ways that the powerful want to use and not in the way that helps ordinary people. So I think natural disasters is a very good example of that. But in the discussion, I would like to go over to some others. Some of you know I have a particular rant about the word community and community-based, or it could be food security, or it could be sustainable. All of these they're more than buzzwords, because buzzwords makes them sound quite innocent. It makes them sound, oh, they're just kind of jargony things that get thrown around. My argument is that they are actually dangerous. And they're dangerous precisely because they enable those who have power to escape looking at responsibility for what is causing the problem that word is supposed to define. Another one is actually poverty. Now, I'll come back to that if there is time. Poverty has now emerged as a concept which is just a characteristic like the color of your hair or the color of your eyes. It isn't actually something that is caused. It is just a demographic number. Anyway, so more focused on the natural disasters aspect, I want to argue that there are historically, and there is a sequence, but I'm going to compress hundreds, if not thousands of years of human history into something very crude and simple, but it's just there as a set of talking points. I think there are three main ways in which people now and historically have sought to explain the key severe events that we now label as disasters. The first is that they are related to culture or religious beliefs, and of course, culture and religion are intimately related. That disasters are determined by God or gods, sometimes as punishment for bad behavior, and there are a whole set of these beliefs around the world, from in Japan, the belief that there's a big catfish that wriggles and causes earthquakes, through to many, many others, which you will all have your own examples of. There are others that death in a disaster is not simply caused by gods, but is actually the fulfillment of the lifespan that was assigned to you. And these are beliefs around the idea of predestination. In Islam, it's qadar, and it's the idea that you, in some versions of Islam, it's the idea that your lifespan is predetermined. So if you die in a disaster, it is related to your religion. The idea that your time is up. We even have that phrase in Britain. The second set of explanations for disaster is that they are natural, the one that we're discussing today. And I think this category actually emerged as a positive opponent to type A disasters being caused by God or gods. And the idea that they're actually natural was a shift away from the idea that God is causing or gods are causing disasters, to the idea that we can explain them by understanding how the earth works and how the atmosphere works. And one of the key points for many people in terms of symbolizing this shift was, I'm sure many of you know, the earthquake of Lisbon in 1755, which is a useful moment in the sense that it is, there's a lot of records of it. There's the debate between Rousseau and Voltaire, and Milletti's very good paper from about 30 years ago. And this gives us a kind of an example of how people then were pushing back on the idea of it being the Christian version of religion towards the idea that you could actually understand these through geology and meteorology. And I think that key moment was a progressive moment in the sense it pushed back against the idea of being caused by God, and the understanding of it could be good. And this also went along with some ideas which were particularly useful, that, for example, Pombal, who acted in the name of the king to do some of the reconstruction after the Lisbon earthquake, recognized some of the ways in which urban planning had made the disaster worse. And Voltaire I think it was Voltaire, and Ksenia uses this in their slides from the a couple of years ago, where there's the argument, if the buildings in Lisbon had not been so tall and so badly constructed, then there would not have been such a disaster. So this particular moment was quite crucial. Now, why is that significant in Christian, and especially in Northern European and the parts of the world where Northern Europeans colonized? Why is it important for them? Because they didn't stop being Christian. The fact that the disaster was not caused by God did not make them have to give up their religion. It was perfectly compatible to have the idea that God was there and created the universe, but God was not responsible for sending every event as for example, as a punishment. And so people did not have to give up on their religion. Now, has everyone in the world adopted the idea that disasters are natural? No. Probably the vast majority of the world still think that disasters are caused by God or gods and have some cultural connotation. And this is the first question for our discussion later in the day, is how do so-called DRR experts or specialists, how do we relate to people who feel the need to explain a disaster in terms of their God or gods? Because the worst thing you can do is go along and say your idea is stupid. Okay, if you do that, you've lost people already. So that is one of the key things, and I know for a fact that almost all major so-called DRR organizations completely ignore this. And I'll give you the reason why in the discussion, if you want to know that, because I did a word count on their policy documents. Okay, and the word religion, culture, religious does not come up once in the ones I looked at. 1,000 pages of policy documents that did not even acknowledge that culture and religion might play a part. Okay, then from that, which was a progressive move in relation to religion, but one which cannot be forced on the majority of people who still think that religion is important in a disaster, what has happened in the last 50 years especially is the movement towards the idea that disasters are socially constructed, as Kevin laid out quite well in his introduction. And this is also a discussion which has been acknowledged in academic work and to some extent by organizations like UNDRR and others who are acknowledging this. But there's still a lot of work to be done on this, and I think that will be fruitful. I don't think anyone in this room needs to have an understanding of why we can consider disasters to be socially constructed. Okay, we can have a debate and discussion about that, in particular, the significance of culture and religion in how we approach the way in which outsiders relate to this. But I do want to say that this is really, really important. The key point we need to understand, why do some organizations and people still want to believe that disasters are natural? What is the incentive for them to need to believe that? Okay, and there can be a range of incentives. The primary one is getting money. So if we go back to the idea that these buzzwords are used in order to avoid explaining why a problem exists, if an organization is reliant on getting money for disaster risk reduction, adaptation, climate change, whatever it is, if they need to get funding, the last thing they want to do is to point out that the government who is either giving the money or using the money is a major source of the problem as to why the disasters happen. Okay, and I'm convinced that is a major part of the problem. I have a slight bit of evidence here, which I think is quite pertinent, from the World Bank, from the Global Facility for DRR, in which I had a debate by email with a senior economist, because he had used the term natural disasters at a conference in California. And I wrote to him after. I couldn't attend the conference, but I wrote to him afterwards and said, what is going on? Because the World Bank 12 years ago published a report which said natural hazards, unnatural disasters. It's free to download. It's quite an interesting approach. It's not terribly good, but at least it's a key point from the same institution arguing that they are not natural, okay? His point was, my choice of word in the conference is not an endorsement of the idea that natural disasters cannot be avoided. It's more an acknowledgement that this is the term decision makers and policymakers, my main audience, the World Bank main audience, use. For instance, we have funding sources that can be used only to reduce the risk from natural disasters. If I do not work on natural disasters, I cannot access those resources. Also, I have not seen any alternative. If a hurricane hitting a city cannot be labeled natural disasters, what is the right term? Now, this is the guy from America who's just seen Katrina, about which there is at least one book that says no natural disaster. So I think we're up against these interest groups, and I think we have to be very plain about that this is a political issue about power and how it is abused. Thank you.